You have just listened to one of the Frottolas intabulated by Andrea Antico in his collection entitled Frottole intabulate da sonare organi. Today I will propose a hypothetical way to conceive the articulation between music and text in the specific case where the text is missing, like in this instrumental arrangement. Of course, a special attention will be given to the specific aspects of performance practice that are involved. I will organize this presentation in three parts. First, I will present the subject and main questions of this research. Then I will show some analysis, and finally, I will play for you the Frottolas I previously analyzed. So, as we all know, in 1517, Andrea Antico published a set of keyboard arrangements containing pieces very famous in his days. Today, such publication is rather well known to modern scholars, mostly due to the fact that it is the first example of printed keyboard repertoire. The pieces arranged in this collection are Frottolas, and as we know, the Frottola was a codified genre where the lyrics often pre-existed to the music and, as we will see, dictated in a way the structure of the music, since they followed strict literary rules. Antico published an instrumental version of those pieces, therefore the text is not immediately visible. Yet it is very likely that the text was very well known to his public. I believe that understanding the lyrics, but even more, understanding the literary conventions of the day is an essential step toward an accurate rendition of this repertoire. In fact, in this repertoire we often find the same music for different texts. For example, in the case of Frottolas with a musical structure like AABB, where the music is repeating but not the text, which doesn't follow the same structure like in the case of sonnet. As a result, the music being the same for different texts cannot possibly depict the meaning of single words, like in the case of the Seconda Pratica, but it seems rather to be a neutral medium for declamation of different texts. If it is so, how was the music performed when no text was heard, like in the case of Andrea Antico instrumental rendition of these Frottolas? I mean, was the musician of the time, when playing these pieces, thinking of the text? Was he thinking even of the different texts? And above all, was he thinking of their literary conventions? Well, contemporary sources confirm that singers in performing this repertoire were supposed to base their performances on the content of the lyrics. So singers were expected to be aware, on the one hand, of the specific content, namely the literal meaning of the text, but on the other hand, they must be aware of the formal one, that is the meter of the lyrics. To be more precise, when I speak of formal content, I mean the metrical structure of the verse that by its own nature lead the performer to a predefined accented pattern that in the specific case of Frottolas, as we will see, is often different from the musical one. Already Brunetto Latini, in his Livre du Trésor, distinguished the speaking in prose from the speaking in verses, and he states that speaking in verses is governed by three parameters. So, three parameters: the weight, the number, and the measure. Latini says that whoever wants to speak in rhyme must count out all the syllables with his fingers in order to be sure that the verse has the right number of syllables. The reader must measure the two last syllables of each verse in order to make the rhyme work properly. And the most important, the reader must respect the right accentuation of the words in order to make the rhymes and also the rhythm of the verse work properly. So these records tell us that the right accentuation of syllables were strictly respected while reading verses, and this already from the 60s of the 13th century. So the poetic material, that is the lyrics, can be analyzed on the basis of two criteria. We have the metric prosodic one, that defines the subdivision of the verse into metric unities, like syllables, feet, stanzas, and etc. And this regardless of the meaning of the text. And on the other hand, we have the syntactic semantic criterion that divides the text into unities of complete logic meaning. Now, these two unities may or may not coincide, although it's often the case in much Italian Renaissance poetry that the two things do overlap. Now I will spend just 2 words on Italian metric, because I think it's very important to better understanding this presentation. Modern Italian poetry is accent-based and not length-based, like in the case of Latin poetry. In other words, Italian poetry is based on the quality of the syllables that can be strong or weak, rather than the quantity, so long or short syllables. For instance, in the Latin poetry, the length of the syllable was the building brick of the meter, and the accent had no structural importance. On the contrary, in Italian poetry, quantity of syllables was not perceived anymore, and the tonic accent was the only important element. Now, from 1550 onward, accented syllables were mostly set to music with long notes and mostly on downbeats. This is the case of most madrigals from half 16th century onward, and according to a scholar, Stefano Lavia, this was done to translate the metric structure of the verse into a musical composition. Stefano Lavia also says that in the moment we put an Italian text, a modern Italian text, in music, automatically the metrical syllable become quantitative. So we have longer notes for accented syllables. But in the case of Frottolas, the situation is very, very different. In fact, we often note some discrepancies between the metric structure, so the accent of the verse, and the music. For instance, we find strong tonic accent of the text put on weak beats of the measure, and often even on upbeats. Now, as an example, let's have a look at incipit, just the first endecasillable of the famous Or che il cielo e la terra, set in music by Monteverdi, and then the version by Tromboncino, the version set in music by Tromboncino. You can see this example on the screen. The metrical reading of the verse is Or che il cielo e la terra e il vento tace. Once more. Or che il cielo e la terra e il vento tace. As you can see in the first case, you can clearly see how the music tried to respect as much as possible the metrical accents of the verse, while the same doesn't happen with the Frottole of Tromboncino. This probably because in the case of Frottolas, the music was rather a blank canvas for performing any text, and the musical pattern predates the choice of lyrics. So the music is rather conceived like a stereotyped structure on which could be sung different texts. In other words, where in later times, in seconda pratica, the music was dressing the text, giving an amplification of the meaning, in the case of Frottola, the music seems often to be nothing more than a neutral medium for reading the text out loud, a sort of a declamation. That is why we often find different texts with the same or very, very similar musical material. And for this purpose, I will compare now the music of two Frottolas. I will compare the first two verses that are Italian decasillabi, taken by the Frottolas Or che il cielo e la terra and Zefiro Spira, both set in music by Tromboncino. You might notice that the musical line of the two decasillabi is almost the same, just with different texts. The difference relies probably on the way the singer would have articulated the text, stressing tonic syllables and giving importance to the meaning of the text. We can also find the same kind of line in other modes, like in the case of the first verse, also an endecasillabo, of the Frottola Che debbio far. In Frottola's repertoire, we find several of these melodic formulas, and each of these formulas fits a different kind of meter, so that we can find musical formulas for any kind of verse. We observe such similar practice still surviving today in the case of the ottava rima toscana, where the presence of stereotyped melodic formulas is probably due to its improvisatory origin. So, the ottava rima toscana is a popular practice still surviving in Tuscany and consists of improvising Italian endecasillabi while singing on some standard musical patterns. So, the performers are familiar with such musical patterns that they can use to sing different texts. The metrical structure of the ottava rima is fixed. We have 8 endecasillabi, that is the most common Italian verse, with a rhyme pattern that follow the structure AB, 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 CC, CD, 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 EE, etc., where the first two verses of the new stanza have to match with the last two verses of the previous one. The structure of Italian endecasillabo is here essential to mention. In the Italian endecasillabo, compulsory accents must fall on the 10th syllable, but they must fall also on the 4th or on the 6th syllable, according to the type of verse. All the other accents of the verse are free, and they can fall on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 8th, and 9th syllable. Most rarely, a tonic accent fall on the 5th syllable. This means that several rhythmical patterns are possible in one verse, and a verse can contain iambic fit, trochaic, dactylic, etc., and the endecasillabo usually mix them together. As far as it can be recorded, the sung ottava rima has always been improvised in a way in between folk and literary tradition, as we can see also in the practice still surviving to our days. The lyrics of the ottava rima, the ottava rima toscana, are improvised on a musical formula called aere, a fixed musical structure meant to help the poet to compose the text with the right number of syllables and without the need to count them out. Stefano Lavia defines these structures as musical stanza for poetry that consists in a sort of neutral musical medium and a creative aid for the poet. I would say that the aere, this musical structure, is the true backbone of the improvisation of the ottava rima, of the ottava rima toscana, in fact the poet has no need to count the syllables because the melodic structure does remind him the metrical structure of the verses. But now let's come back to Frottolas. Renaissance Frottolas, as we saw, are somehow similar. Pierrotta already pointed out that Frottolas owe their form to a folkloric oral tradition, although they are a nobler and more refined form of it. In fact, we know that Frottolas are a product made by and for the cultivated North Italian courts. Francis Biggi, that was my professor in medieval and Renaissance music at Geneva Conservatory, dedicated an important part of his researches to this topic. And Biggi pointed out several common elements between Frottolas and ottava rima. Let's see. Frottolas, like the ottava rima, are based on some sort of aere, as we have just seen. From a musical point of view, the use of polyphony is limited, with a prominent upper voice that sings often syllabically. In Frottolas, melismas are scarce, like in the ottava rima, and melismas are present only in cadences. Frottola's repertoire is a monodic one, like the ottava rima. In fact, we know that Frottolas were mainly sung by one voice, accompanied by instruments, in spite of the fact that several publications present Frottolas in part books. Actually, we have plenty of examples of solo performances preferred over polyphonic renditions during Renaissance in Italy. Baldassare Castiglione praises the declamation on the viola over polyphonic singing because we can better understand the tune, but foremost because it allows a better recitation of the lyrics. But even more interesting is another record. In a letter to Pico della Mirandola, Italian poet Angelo Poliziano, who was himself a renowned singer, describes a banquet in the Orsini Palace. During this dinner, the son of Paolo Orsini, Fabio, sings with some fellows for the guests some polyphony. And Poliziano points out that the piece was performed from notation, so the musicians were reading the music probably from part books. However, Poliziano shows all his enthusiasm when Fabio sings alone some verses by Piero de' Medici, accompanying himself on a lute. The interesting point of this record is that Poliziano refers that Fabio's voice, singing the monody, was neither that of a reader nor that of a singer, but that the listener could have perceived it as a both, without even being able to distinguish whether he was singing or reading. He says that it was full of modulation, changing intonation according to the text, and slowing down or speeding up. So, if this is how this monodic repertoire was understood by the contemporaries, we should ask ourselves how this was mirrored in the performance practice of instrumental intabulation of the same music and in the same period. If the metrical structure of this repertoire was so well understood, did the player of the time imagine the lyrics while playing this repertoire on the keyboard? But overall, was the player able to infer the correct accentuation of the music from an implicit text? If so, a correct understanding of the meter and of poetical conventions would be an essential element for a correct performance of Antico's intabulation. So, let us now discuss how I proceeded in my analysis of these Frottolas. Firstly, I transcribed the lyrics from the vocal score trying to respect as much as possible the right placement of the text on the keyboard intabulation. Then I analyze the lyrics according to the two criteria I mentioned above, that is the syntactic semantic analysis according to the meaning of the lyrics, and the metric prosodic analysis according to the meta. After this double analysis, I worked on the music and I circled the tonic syllables of the lyrics directly on the score. I used red for the first text and blue for the repetitive present. I noted the second text on the loud staff to make it comprehensible. On top of this metrical analysis, I superimpose a set of signs to indicate a semantic analysis. For instance, I indicated whenever a comma or a breath was needed for the understanding of the text. This beside the already present interpunction markings on the lyrics. Concerning the Frottolas I analyzed, we can divide the pieces into two groups. In the first group, we find Frottolas based on decasillabi and settenari. In the other group, we find Frottolas whose text is based on ottonari or settenari tronchi. Why those two groups? Because of the metrical structures that are very, very different. In fact, since endecasillabi and settenari allow a more free accentuation patterns, the combination between music and text is often conflicting and generates unusual patterns. Due to the structure of those verses, in these Frottolas we find several different metric fits, such as a iambic, trochaic, dactylic, resulting sometimes in a structure very close to spoken language. In these Frottolas, tonic syllables of the text are not infrequently placed on downbeats or even on upbeats of the music, and such conflicting accentuation patterns could ideally be solved in a sung performance. For example, a singer could easily stress any syllable, keeping the right accentuation of the verse. He could, to quote Poliziano, modulate, he could change intonation according to the text, he could slow down or speeding up. So a singer would probably counterbalance the wrong accentuation with a correct stress in the performance. But on the instrument, the same thing could be other, or even it could appear unnatural since no words are present. So, should an instrumentalist do the same? I mean, as a singer. Should an instrumentalist stress or even repeat some notes just because some unheard text is present? My approach on this repertoire tried to follow these paths, and I hope this presentation will raise some awareness on this topic. As you will listen my examples, taking in account the literary conventions of the time impose on the instrumentalist to rethink in a way the music and some time to opt, I would say often, for some unusual choice in playing this repertoire. For instance, the fact to stress some upbeat, the fact to rethink the metrical structure, the structure of the music, even the way to consider phrasing. Now let's go to the other group. On the contrary, in the second group, as we will see, we find much more clear accentuation patterns. Here, the metrical accents of the verse mainly coincide with strong accents of measure, since the ottonario e the settenario tronco is made mostly of iambic feet that gives a very regular rhythm to the verse. I will now present more in details the analysis of two Frottolas, one from the first group and another from the second, which I will also play after each analysis. At the end of this paper, I will play some more Frottolas from Antico's intabulation, and you can follow my analysis directly on the screen. Let's now start with the analysis of Or che il cielo e la terra by Bartolomeo Tromboncino. During this analysis, I will show only the spots where a discrepancy between text and music occurs. But in the end, when I will play the full piece, I will show on the screen all the tonic accents and the interpunction marks. So, the text comes from Petrarca's Canzoniere. It is a sonnet made of Italian endecasillabi. As you can see, the music has the following structure: AA, BB, CC, D, and it is based on a rather common aire as we previously saw. I will now proceed section by section. Section A. The piece begins with a shifted accents. We have an upbeat on the syllable or that according to the meter of the verse should be on a downbeat. This is followed by an accented syllable on K that on the contrary should be weak. The second verse of the sonnet starts with an anapest to a stressed syllable followed by a stressed one with a tonic accent on fere, ele fere. This tonic accent falling here on the weak beat of the bar. Now, in the instrumental version, the C in the cantus on the syllable fe of the word fere is notated as a single long note, probably thinking of a performance on the organ. Whereas in the vocal version, the note C is syllabically repeated for the two syllable fere. In order to underline this accentuated syllable, we could probably repeat the C. Now, the third verse of the sonnet presents the same structure of the first line. That is a trochee, a dactyl, and three other trochees. The rhythm should sound like pam 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 pam. So now with the words: notte carro stellato in giro mena. And the first tonic accent on the syllable knock of the word nocte falls here on an upbeat, and the second strong accent of the syllable car, the word carro, on a weak beat of the bar. In the instrumental version, also here we see only a long note. Since the text goes semantically on between A and A first, we should probably just not stop the flow in the cadence. Let's continue now with section A first. The structure is here a bit more regular, and the tonic accents of the lyrics mostly coincide with the strong beats of the bar, of the measure. Yet in the fifth verse of the sonnets, the syllable veg of the word veggio falls on the upbeat instead of a downbeat. And later on in the same line, same verse, the syllable pen of the word penso is also placed on a weak beat of the measure. The same happens in the sixth verse of the sonnet with the syllables sem e pe of the words sempre e pena. Now, sections B and B first. These two sections display only one discrepancy between text and music. On the tonic accent of the word guerra, so syllable guer, that falls here on an upbeat instead of a downbeat, as it should be according with the meter of the verse. In the section C, music and text are not in agreement in line 9 of the sonnet, on the anapest così sol, where the accented syllable sol falls on a weak beat of the measure instead of a strong one. The same in verse 10 on the syllables mo e dol of the word move e dolce, again in line 11 with the syllable man, una man. In section C first, we find the same accented patterns that in section C, with an exception for the line 14 of the sonnet, where the syllable dal of the word dalla falls on a weak beat of the measure instead of a strong one. And the same happens in the section D, in which the last verse of the sonnet is repeated exactly in the same way. The second group contains Frottolas based on ottonari and settenari tronchi. We will now analyze O che dirà l'amo. Other examples of this group are Per dolor mi bagno il viso, Animoso mio desire, and Non più morte al mio morire. I will perform these other Frottolas at the end of this presentation. This Frottola is made of regular settenari tronchi and exclusively by iambic feet. The accentuation pattern in the lyrics is very clear, with a perfect match between metrical accents and musical accents, as you can see. Yet, in the instrumental adaptation, we find some surprises. From a semantic point of view, in fact, the end of a musical sentence consistently overlaps with the following one that make quite difficult to breathe between semantic periods. I marked in red the main logical divisions in the text and in blue the secondary divisions, for example, to indicate the commas. To close this presentation, I will play for you some other Frottolas. You can see my analysis on the screen while I'm playing. Thank you very much for your attention.